The Enlightenment was the period where all of our modern science and technology and ways of thinking evolved and developed. And it was an incredible effort as it was coming into being and as it was promulgating itself through society. And one of the reasons, or in fact the only reason, that people were able to motivate themselves, to hold themselves to these extraordinarily high standards. So for instance, standards of industrialization was so challenging, but people could say to themselves that, well, it might be horrific for me in this factory, but maybe my children will have a better time. Maybe the factories will be able to produce enough wealth for us all. And then when it came to reason, it came to science, it was obviously destroying a lot of people's beliefs, but they thought, but we'll be able to find something in the future. We'll be able to use these tools to make what we need, and everything will be good. There's a sort of promised land over the horizon that people thought of with the Enlightenment. So even though the demands are extremely challenging and required a huge amount of effort and self-sacrifice, they had a promise on the other end. And I think what's happened in the last 100-ish years, say, in every possible domain that the Enlightenment touched, which was pretty much the whole element of culture, psychology, everything, is that the promised land has, in a sense, been reached as far as it can be. Well, we've discovered that there's a limit. We can't really get to what we desired. So, for instance, when it comes to technology, we now have all of the technology that's necessary to create the wealth for everyone to have wealth. But of course, there's still a lot of people who are suffering without wealth. And there doesn't seem to be an obvious solution to that problem, at least not within the Enlightenment values. When it comes to science, people wanted to understand the world perfectly. They wanted to find the rules that dictated how the world worked. But of course, you can see that with someone like Newton. He wanted to find the rules, and then he could predict the future. But then when you get to quantum mechanics, you realize that, well, the world doesn't actually operate on rules. It operates on probabilities. So there's a limit. We've reached this sort of limit. On the road to the promised land, we realize we can't actually get past. And it even happens in things like in philosophy and logic, where we have postmodern philosophy. We have the failure of logical positivism, and people like Kurt Gödel, who show that logic has this sort of a limit that it can't get to. It can't establish this pristine, perfect world. There's just a foundational barrier between us and this perfect, true world that the Enlightenment was aiming for. So I think what we're left with now is we still have only at the fringes has this failure of the Enlightenment been realized. The quantum theorists realize it. Some economists probably realize it. Although I would say probably it's more difficult for the economists to not be caught up in ideologies. Certainly some philosophers have realized it. So now, but since most people haven't realized it, we still have this attitude in our culture which is like the Enlightenment. We have so much of this baked into the culture, which is that if we can just make these things perfect, if we can sort of perfect the systems of reason, we can perfect the democratic system, then we can make everything work perfectly. We still have this desire to create a perfectly functioning mechanism that will regulate culture, society, psychology. Everything will be made perfect. But for those people, and I think so that's popular, but we still feel the sense that it's not going to work. So we have these rivaling, unspoken intuitions in us, where part of our intuition is this Enlightenment intuition. If we can just make things more reasonable, then that will be the promised land. But on the other hand, we know that that's not going to work. And both of these things are intuitions that we don't really have words to say. They're just sort of sitting there latent in our consciousness. And when you're thinking, or when this intuition appears in your mind, that even if you were to make everything perfect in Enlightenment terms, you would still not get anything. So when you realize this sort of this quantum thing, or you realize this economic situation or the logical situation, the demands of the Enlightenment feel like shackles. Because during the Enlightenment, as this promised land was on the horizon, we were heading towards it, they felt like, okay, these are extraordinary demands, but of course they are going to promise us extraordinary boons, so they're worth it. This is training. We're going to find, we're heading somewhere, we're walking to the promised land. Of course, it's going to be an arduous journey. Whereas now we know that that we're not getting any further. We're at the promised land. And to hold ourselves to those demands now feels like an unnecessary torture. And in fact, I think this is exactly the feeling that people get when a religion becomes a dogma. If there is no animating principle, if there is no sort of experience or practice, then training and learning and constraining yourself into any kind of mode, it's just slavery. It's just self-torment for no reason. You can imagine someone who is trying to learn how to be a sportsman. Obviously, the training is extraordinarily difficult, but it's justified because on the other end they get to play their sport or they get to compete, and then that's when it's all for. So they have to hold themselves to these constraints, but then they get to. Those constraints make sense. They have a practice on the horizon. But what happens, I think, with the Enlightenment constraints is that there is no point in the future where we're going to get to apply them. So now they just feel like constraints. And so, of course, we want to turn over those constraints. So there's this extraordinary revolutionary tendency in our psychology. Because now we just have these things crowding in on our attention that are actually distracting us and have no potential to be useful to us. So we want to get rid of them. And I think that's why I mentioned religion, is that a lot of people, I think, have Christian dogma, say, in their minds. And then you get to a point where you realize that it's not serving you at all. It's actually just getting in your way. So then you have to shed that dogma so that you can have fresh eyes. And I think we feel the same way now as a culture about the Enlightenment. So I'd say that a good analogy for what our situation is it's kind of just like when you have too many things on your computer desktop. You put them there because it's useful. You want to put these shortcuts there. You want to put all these files there so that you can access them and make things easier. But then again, eventually you get to a point where there's just too many and it's now crowding. So you want to delete them. You want to go, okay, fuck this. I want a fresh start. But what might happen is that you start deleting things and, oops, I deleted System 32. Now my computer doesn't work. And I think that's something similar to what could happen in our situation now, where we have these unnecessary Enlightenment constraints, which of course don't apply to us anymore because the promised land is foregone. But in trying to revolt against them and to clear our vision so that we can have this fresh view, I think we might end up destroying too many things. And it's not only a concern that we'll destroy things that are important, it's that we'll actually sabotage our own mission to have clearer eyes. This is my real problem. Because what often happens is that a revolutionary attitude will say, let's clear away all of the detritus, all of the culture that's getting in the way. And then a more traditional view would be that this is going to destroy the traditions. But my view is that if you try and revolt too quickly, you will inevitably just produce a traditional resurgence. So if you try and clear away, if you try and have this fresh new view, but if you're childish about it, if you have a sort of adolescent revolutionary tendency, you tend to go back into the most horrible version of the tradition. I mean, a classic example would be in the French Revolution, where they had this revolution, they wanted democracy, and then you had the terror, which was far, far worse fascism than they experienced under the king. And then after that, you had Napoleon, who was the proto-fascist, who sort of was the model for people like Hitler, who wanted to create the empire of the ancient world. So I think if you go forward too fast, my problem isn't actually that we're going to destroy the old traditions. I don't really care about that. If you go forward too fast, you stop going forward. You have to do it like a sort of intentional, slow progress. Well, not necessarily slow. It could still very well be revolutionary, but there is a way of hamstringing your own revolution. So I think what we're in now is this nascent revolutionary tendency trying to throw off the fetters of the Enlightenment so that we can move to the new era, because the Enlightenment's over. We've got all the boons that we can. We're moving to the new era now. And we want to move past. We want to get rid of all of these old constraints. But just exactly how we're going to do that, I think there's just so many pitfalls that can be negative. So all I would say then is that for the future, for the creation of whatever new thing is going to happen, the only thing that you can do to try and hope that will happen better, or to ensure that this new mode will occur properly, is to force yourself to keep the clearest possible eyes, and to have the most unbounded and fluid attention. I think those are the only certainties, because everything else is likely to turn into a dogma and a pitfall. Everything else will turn into some kind of distraction or some kind of ideology. The only thing that could possibly prevent the potential catastrophes of this change in era is attention.